I'm back, and for once, my shirt doesn't match my background. As you obviously know from reading the title, because no one clicks on a video without having read the title, I'm talking about my least favorite pieces of writing advice I've come across in my time. I have 5, and these are things that just, like, when I have heard them, they just grind my gears. They make me so angry because they're just bullshit. Like, they're just not true, or at the very least not universally true. So when writers really tout them as like this ultimate form of writing advice, or like something that is always true for every writer all the time, it just drives me up a wall. So here are my 5 least favorite pieces of writing advice and why I dislike them so much. The first one is only write if you have something to say. And this is kind of true, but also not true. I don't think... The reason that I think this isn't always true is because it implies that to be a writer, your novels have to have some deep and profound meaning of life thing to them in order to be worthwhile, and that's just not true. Do I think a good book has morals and themes to it? Yes. But do I think that every book that's written needs to be the next great American novel that attempts to answer what the meaning of life is? No. I think that sometimes a book can be good just because the characters are meaningful or the plot is interesting, and they don't necessarily have to have been written by the next William Faulkner or Margaret Atwood. Those are great authors who have said great things in their works, but that doesn't mean that you have to write like them or have as profound of thoughts to be a writer and to write. I think there's plenty of merit in a fantasy book that has an important theme or moral and message, but is not necessarily attempting to claw at the meaning of life. I also don't think that when you start a book, you necessarily need to know what the themes of that book are. I think for a lot of people, especially discovery writers like me, as you write the book, you discover the themes that you were intending to tackle the whole time by writing. It can be sort of a discovery process, like ingrained in figuring out the plot and the characters, that comes with the process of writing and is not necessarily something you know from the outset. And at times, if you know the theme and moral and message of the book at the beginning, you attempt to put it into the book a little bit too much, and it can turn very preachy very quickly. So that's why I think this writing advice just sucks, and you can just pretty much toss it out a window for all I care. In my opinion, it's just utter garbage, like garbage advice. But that's just me. Maybe you're the kind of person who thinks that people do need to have something to say before they write. But in my opinion, if you just want to write about some dude slaying dragons, then you write about some dude slaying dragons and have a good time doing it. The second piece of writing advice that really gets me heated is the idea that said is dead. And this comes with like lists and lists and lists that you usually can find on like Pinterest. If you are part of like this, you see those writerly pins that people have on there where it's like alternatives to the word said, and it just drives me insane. Because if you had ever read something written by someone who truly believes said is dead, it is the clunkiest, like, slogfest of reading you have ever experienced. A good example of this, and of course this has many other problems, is the fanfiction My Immortal. if you know anything about it, you know that it has a slew of other problems. But if you were to read it and ignore some of the like typing grammatical errors, like one issue with the writing is that she, the author, never uses the word said, and it starts to really stand out and grind on you when you keep reading these alternatives to said over and over and over again. Said is a very good word because it's an invisible word, and if you do not need to convey a very specific emotion or type of speech, said works just fine as a stand-in. Said is really only dead if you are constantly using adverbs after it to describe how that person is saying something. Of course, I am the worst culprit of doing this, so like, I am being a bit of a hypocrite in saying that, but I'm aware that that's not exactly good writing. It's a habit I picked up because I read almost only Harry Potter growing up, and that's how J.K. Rowling writes. But anyway, I understand that like if somebody uses said only and then a bunch of adverbs, like that's considered bad writing because overusing said and overusing adverbs is like two sins. And like, by the way, I don't think adverbs are that bad either. Like, they can work. Keep that in mind. But anyway, said, if they are just saying he said, she said, Frida said, Pippi said, those are characters in my book, then that's fine if they just leave it there. It's invisible. It just tells you who is talking because it doesn't matter how they are saying those words. Of course, sometimes you can leave this dialogue tag off altogether and go into action tags instead, in which case you can cut out said if you're that desperate to, but sometimes you need a dialogue tag, you don't want to have an action tag to slow down the dialogue, and so if you're in a big conversation with more than two characters, you don't want an action tag there, but you have to say who's talking, using said can be just perfectly fine. So it gets me really heated when people say said is dead because it works just fine in a lot of scenarios. So please do not overuse said replacements because it's horrible writing. It is so noticeable when that's what you're doing, and it's just like a slog to get through books that are like that, and it will make me DNF a book if the writer is a said is dead kind of person. The third piece of writing advice is one that if you've read my Large Cast of Characters book, you will know I disagree with, and that is like the advice to avoid archetypes or using like archetypes for your characters, which I just think is like utter nonsense. Like, I understand sort of where this is coming from, and that like if you rely too heavily on putting characters into archetypes, like they can start to feel very cardboard and two-dimensional, but at the same time, like there is a reason these archetypes exist, and putting your characters to fit into these archetypes so that they all have a role in the story, and you know they have a role, and that they don't need to be written out, and that they need to stay in the story. Archetypes can be very useful. Archetypes include things like protagonist and antagonist, which for a lot of novels are very important archetypes to fill, or things like best friend, comedic relief, and love interest, which again tend to pop up in a lot of stories, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with comedic relief as long as the characters are not just comedic relief. I mean, look at Fred and George Weasley from the Harry Potter series. They are undoubtedly the comedic relief of the series. But they aren't just that, so it works that they are that archetype. Same with Ron and Hermione as the best friends, Harry as the protagonist, Ginny Weasley as the love interest. Those things are fine. They fit those archetypes, but those archetypes are not their characters. So when people say, like, avoid using archetypes and using archetypes to cast your characters, like, that's just nonsense. Just don't use those archetypes to create the entirety of your characters. But if you use those archetypes as the basis for your characters, I think you'll be just fine. And so it drives me up a wall when people say, like, avoid using archetypes. Like, why? Comedic relief can be really great. And I love a good mentor character. We all do. That's why we all love Gandalf and Dumbledore so much. The fourth piece of bad writing advice that I've heard is to edit as you go. I heard this sometime in my youth from someone who must have just been another newbie writer, or had been the 1% of writers who can edit as they go and it not be an issue for them. For you watching, if you do not already know that editing as you go works for you, do not try it. It does not work for most people. Most people would benefit from writing and moving on until they get to the end of their book, and then going back to the beginning and editing it through. Because most writers are perfectionists. And most writers want to see the best from their work. And most writers are very self-conscious about the quality of their work. So, if they edit as they go, they tend to get stuck in a cycle of editing and editing and editing the same thing and never moving on because what they're editing is never good enough. The other reason this advice just fucking sucks and is dumb is because if you just keep doing the same section over and over again, you're not writing more, and therefore really not improving. And therefore, your edits are becoming redundant and not improvements upon what you've already written. So instead, if you were to just keep writing forward, you'll gain more and more talent and abilities and practice in writing, so that when you go back to edit your earlier chapters, you've improved, so you can really see the problem areas more clearly, and you've given yourself time from that particular chapter to really see the problems with that chapter, as opposed to fixating too much on the same chapter before you've really given yourself to improve by writing more, and you end up in a loop that you can never get out of. It just doesn't make any fucking sense for most people to edit as they go. If for some reason you're the anomaly and it works for you, swell. But if you were here because you were genuinely looking for new writing advice or to debunk some writing advice you've heard, maybe this is something you're doing, and probably you should stop. And if you have never finished a whole draft of your book already, it doesn't work for most people. And it doesn't give you a chance to grow or improve or get distance from what you've already written. Please stop trying to edit as you go. It doesn't work. And the fifth and final piece of writing advice that drives me up a wall is to write what you know. This writing advice is so stupid, it's unbelievable. We would have the most boring assortment of books imaginable if people only wrote what they know. For a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of the same kind of person in the writing market. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. To be honest, I fit into that general category, so I can't really talk shit about this age range of middle class white women who tend to dominate a lot of genres of writing, especially young adult fantasy. That's what I am. I'm not trying to talk shit on the people who are in the market right now, but it does mean that there is a limited worldview that we have, and if we only wrote what we knew, then there would be no diversity in the stories being told. And I understand the argument that we should leave the space for people who have those experiences to write these stories, and I don't disagree. But I don't think it makes any sense for us to only write our experiences, because like literally who cares? And also, like, I like to write fantasy books. You know what I do not know about is random fantasy worlds. Because they do not exist. I can write things I know in the sense of like, I can write about relationships similar to the relationships I've had because I've experienced them. I've experienced love and a certain familial background. But that doesn't mean I can't imagine what a different kind of familiar background would look like, and I cannot write that experience. So that's just nonsense. Like, I can imagine what it's like to be raised by grandparents or a single mom, or as an only child even. Those are not my experiences, but I can understand and think and imagine what those things might be like. I have a brain. I've known people with those sorts of experiences. There's no reason I can't write them. There's no reason I can't write from a male's perspective just because I'm a woman. There's no reason I can't include characters of color or with different kinds of disabilities because I don't have a physical disability or I'm white. Of course, should stories that are predominantly about cultures other than my own be told by people from that? Sure, perhaps. I'm white. I'm really not going to talk on that sort of thing. It's not really my space to dictate whether or not that's acceptable, but like I do know that I have the ability to write about things I don't know about firsthand. Things like boarding schools, or magic, or dragons, or being raised by a single mother, or watching my best friend die, I don't know. Like, things that I've never experienced before, I can write about them in my book. And that's okay. It's more important that you write what you love and what you're passionate about. For me, that is fantasy. I cannot say I know about fantasy, like I've read fantasy, but I do not live in a fantasy world. I live on Earth. But I can still write about fantasy because I love fantasy and I love dragons, and that's okay. So basically what I'm saying is, like, there are some things maybe you shouldn't write about. That's really not my place to say. But you don't necessarily have to stick just with what you know. You can go a little bit outside of that. Most people do with a certain amount of success, which is why this rating advice is just kind of stupid. But anyway, I've ranted about advice that I do not like for long enough, so I'm going to cut the video here. I will see you guys in my next video. But if you have things and advice that you do not like that you have heard before, or if you think any of these pieces of writing advice are actually worth a damn, then leave a comment down below and tell me why, or what writing advice you don't like, and we can discuss it. Otherwise, subscribe and ring that bell to be notified, and I don't know, follow me on Instagram. That's the kind of thing we're supposed to say, right? Yeah, and otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!